It was a habit, I think, for the kids to run down to the corner.
Some actors collect awards. Gregory Peck collected enemies, not the ordinary kind born from petty jealousy, but the kind earned through real confrontations with real men who crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. For decades, Hollywood celebrated him as its conscience, its gentleman, its moral center. What the official story left out was the private one, where 5 of the most powerful actors in the golden age of American cinema pushed him far enough that he stopped pretending to forgive them and simply erased them from his life. His career spanned more than 50 years. His performance as Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird did not just win him the Academy Award, it made him a symbol, a living argument that film could reach into the actual conversation a country was having about itself. He won the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was admired across generations. And underneath all of that, in the private rooms where Hollywood's real relationships were negotiated, he carried a list, not a written one. The kind that lives in memory and never needs updating because the names on it never change. Marlon Brando arrived during a Western shot in Montana in the mid-1970s. The producers had assured Peck that Brando had matured. Peck accepted that and showed up the way he always did. Before dawn, every line memorized, every beat of the character already mapped. Preparation was the private agreement he had made with himself from the beginning. Showing up unprepared was theft from everyone invested in the work. Brando arrived hours late on the first morning carrying a battered suitcase containing no script notes but bottles of liquor, 3 live snakes, and a small toy piano. The piano, he explained to no one in particular, helped him channel emotional colors. On the first shooting day, he settled into a corner, struck a few discordant notes, and announced that the scene would be played in blue. The moment that broke things permanently came during a key dialogue scene. Peck carried his character's full weight into the take. Brando walked into frame cradling a live pigeon, released it mid-take, and watched it fly into the rafters with genuine dreamy pleasure while half his lines dissolved with it. When the director called cut, Peck walked to the edge of the set and said quietly that what had just happened was not acting. It was vandalism. The weeks that followed wore Peck down as no other production ever had. Brando whispered lines at volumes the microphones could barely retrieve, then detonated into improvisations so far from the agreed text that everyone else in the scene lost their footing. In a private meeting, Peck reportedly told the room they were there to make a motion picture, not witness an exorcism. Brando heard about it, offered a smirk, and suggested it was Peck's soul that needed freeing. That was the end of any goodwill. From that afternoon forward, Brando existed in Peck's accounting as the embodiment of everything he had defined himself against. Chaos presented as artistry, selfishness dressed as creative courage, and contempt for the people laboring alongside you? Frank Sinatra. Communicated something different. Not that the work had been desecrated, but that it was not sacred at all. Their time together came in the early 1960s on a wartime drama in California. Peck showed up at 6 in the morning, full costume, character ready. Sinatra typically appeared around midday, sometimes carrying the previous evening on him, and the crew rebuilt the day's schedule around his arrival with the resignation of people who had stopped expecting anything different. During a tense infirmary sequence, Peck had found the quiet anguish the scene required and given himself entirely to it. Down the set came a faint, lazy whistle. Peck looked up to find Sinatra leaning against a prop hospital bed, casual as a man, deciding whether the afternoon was worth attending to. Between takes, Sinatra spat on the floor and announced to a nearby grip at a volume calibrated to carry that St. Gregory over there was saving souls for the Academy. When the director pressed Sinatra to focus, the response came with the confidence of someone who had played Caesar's Palace and considered that credential to settle most arguments about emotion. Peck answered in a voice so level it cut harder than anger, telling Sinatra directly that this was not a showroom, they were not doing an encore, and they were there to tell a story. For the rest of the production, Peck delivered his lines and turned away. The engagement ended at the edge of what the script demanded and went not one word further. Asked years later whether he would share a set with Sinatra again, Peck said simply he would sooner act opposite an empty chair because the chair would at least respect the call time. Richard Burton. Went after something more personal. Brando had desecrated the work. Sinatra had disrespected the schedule. Burton went after Peck's identity, the moral seriousness, the quiet integrity, the belief that the craft of acting could mean something beyond the moment it occupied. At a Beverly Hills party in the mid-1960s, a mutual acquaintance introduced Peck as the man who gave the world Atticus Finch. Burton raised his glass and delivered his verdict to the room. Gregory Peck was not an actor. He was a sermon in a tuxedo. Laughter moved through the room with the ease it always finds when a powerful man says something sharp in an elegant setting. Peck produced a tight smile and gave it no more response than that. Burton had no intention of letting it heal. In interviews, he offered casual observations that Peck performed every scene as though addressing the United Nations, and privately called him Saint Gregory, patron saint of studio morality, in conversations that proved less private than intended. When a European production attempted to bring both men together in 1965, Peck set the script down 20 pages in and told his agent he was willing to work with anyone in the industry, but not with a man who had made contempt for everything Peck stood for into his defining professional characteristic. The project collapsed. Burton responded with fury, arguing that Peck's reputation held more power in Hollywood than his body of work justified, which was, in its own unintentional way, a fairly honest statement about what had been driving the hostility all along. The silence Peck built around Burton was so complete it had the character of a formal verdict rather than a personal grudge. No appeals were accepted. John Wayne. Was not a story about art. It was a story about America, about what America was and who had earned the right to speak in its name. Their collision was ideological, built on the deepest disagreement two men can carry about the meaning of the country they both claimed to love. By the early 1960s, Peck had grown into something beyond stardom. Atticus Finch had arrived at precisely the historical moment when a particular kind of American conscience was most urgently needed and most bitterly contested. Civil rights petitions carried Peck's name. Statements against Vietnam carried his name. Wayne found all of it not just wrong but genuinely dangerous, and his contempt was entirely authentic. The open confrontation came at an industry dinner in the early 1970s, with enough of Hollywood assembled to ensure that whatever happened would carry. After an evening of drinking, Wayne rose and fixed his attention across the room. If the country were populated with men like Gregory Peck, he said, it would have surrendered before the first bullet of any war was ever fired. Peck rose, placed his glass down carefully, and answered without raising his voice. If the country were populated with men like Wayne, he said, it would never know what peace felt like. No laughter followed. Two men had looked directly at each other and said, without pretense, exactly what they thought. No further scenes were required between them. When Wayne was dying in 1979, Peck told a close friend privately that he was praying for Wayne's soul, but still could not look him in the eye. That sentence holds more truth about the nature of their feud than any analysis could manage, because it holds both things at once, the genuine wish for another human being's peace and the honest acknowledgement that certain kinds of damage cannot be prayed away. Kirk Douglas was the strangest case, because what drove their decades-long tension was not one explosive incident, but something quieter and considerably more corrosive: comparison. Where Peck pulled his performances inward and let stillness carry the weight, Douglas pushed outward and let every audience know that something enormous was being spent on their behalf. They occupied the same tier of stardom across the same decades and represented genuinely different philosophies about what screen acting owed the audience. Journalists who asked Douglas about his contemporaries found that the warmth he extended to others had a tendency to evaporate when the conversation reached Peck's name. In one interview, he noted that Peck was as stiff as a board, and that he himself would rather break than stand that straight. None of that compared to what happened the night Peck won the Academy Award for To Kill a Mockingbird in 1963. As the audience rose to applaud, Douglas sat with a drink and told those around him that if Peck were truly Atticus Finch, the town celebrating him would not be drowning in the very hypocrisy it was drowning in. The comment reached Peck within days. no public response came. When Columbia Pictures later proposed casting both men in a World War II resistance film, Peck told the director without elaboration that he had no interest in sharing a frame with a man who had mistaken volume for truth. Douglas responded with long-suppressed grievance, calling Peck a hypocrite with a halo. What Douglas never managed to say publicly, but eventually admitted in private after a stroke had stripped away the armor, was that the resentment had never truly been about Gregory Peck at all. Peck was the man he had spent decades resenting, envying, and, in the most private place inside himself, wishing he could have been. That admission, offered near the end of a long life with no time left for anything less than honesty, carries more weight than any award either man received, because it names clearly what their rivalry was always measuring underneath. Not talent, not box office, not the verdict of any academy or audience. Integrity. The kind that cannot be manufactured or publicized into existence. The kind that lives in a person from the inside or does not live there at all. And Gregory Peck carried it without announcement, without effort, and without exception, from the first day he stood in front of a camera to the very last day of his life.